Hey Scott,
Hey Marty.
how's it going?
Oh, pretty good. How are you?
All right, I'm good too. We're about to knock it out the park with the introduction here, finally finishing up this well-named last section, Atheism as Uberpiety, which might strike some folks as sarcastic, but it's not really.
Yeah. No, he interesting is how I first read this, but what he's actually saying is like that atheism is provides kind of our best way into understanding the kind of religious experience he's trying to get at.
Yeah. So there are basically two uh, types of religious experience. The one that has predominated, we'll call it type one, is religion as a sort of mechanism for reducing uncertainty. So, in general, this will give you a sense of your own identity and your relation to your community and your relation to the larger world as a whole, so that you're going to be given a kind of cohesive set of rules or narratives, and you're going to be given a way of being in the world that gives you a place so that you feel some sense of certainty about your existence as opposed to the sort of constant anxiety of not really knowing what's next or whatever, which is, much the way that, we experience the world. And so that, science would be a part of this progression of trying to have greater and greater intelligibility of our world and our experience so that we can have more and more control over it.
Right. And then the second type of religious experience is like one where we're experiencing somewhat like of a good word for it would be a decentering of where like our place in the universe or some not necessarily that intense. I mean, we'll talk about kind of some of the some examples of it. It could be, you know, in art and dance where there's a change from, you know, one way of doing things or one predominant art form to another. Um, and so I think that was where we talked about starting out like kind of discussing the different ways that we can have a kind of mystical or a religious experience through in different ways in our life.
Yeah, so I mean, he mentions quite a few what we would think of as ecstatic experiences, perhaps, where we have an ecstasis again is like standing outside of oneself, or going beyond one's programming or something like that, one's identity. So your examples here that he gives are like music, dance, art, drugs, things that we came up with also were theory and hermeneutics. And again, hermeneutics is just like this, I guess, art of interpreting ambiguous things that resist clear and simple identifications.
Yeah. So I think like we can go through and kind of like give our examples maybe and like hopefully that people can latch on and have their own ideas. But one of the things that one of the things Marty and I love together is music, and we've like grew up in the Midwest rave scene, um, and the it's such an interesting form of music because it was the artists who created this music in really in two cities in the Midwest, Detroit and Chicago, took instruments that had been discarded by real musicians because those instruments didn't have sounds that they considered to be authentic enough. They sounded too fake. So like we all know that from the
Synthetic.
synthetic, right? And that's like so the musicians put those all, hawk them, at the pawn shops. And so these teenagers in Chicago and in Detroit bought these instruments and found new ways to repurpose these sounds that actually made a kind of music that really reflected their environment and spoke to them about uh, their hopes for the future and created a culture and like an identity around the sound that like house and techno.
So anytime there's a kind of openness to a paradigm shift, and in this case, a paradigm shift in music, there's going to be a kind of like period of time when people like don't even know what they're hearing at first. And so this has got to be a sort of cultivated state of mind where you're able to accept and get into something that you're not used to hearing. This is something that sounded very mechanical and industrial to people, artificial because it, often was sample-based music, on things that, were rejected by real musicians and whatnot. And I can remember people often telling me it's not really music. And
Yeah.
this is, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say a lot of the music that was sampled was disco music, which was something that was
Yeah.
discarded, very, notably by white Americans. That it continued on in black culture in the cities. But yeah, that a lot of it was very just um, ecstatic music that had a lot like really could get dance. I mean, was really incorporate with dance. And so it was like, I mean, yeah, I want to actually let you go ahead, Marty. But yeah, I just wanted to make that point about like how some of these not only was the instruments used to make the sound and make these beats, this like loud, like industrial beats, but there was also soul injected into this music through the sampling, through the use like of gospel music and some of the forms of creating a rhythmic like uh ecstatic,
Yeah.
build.
Yeah, no, I know either neither Scott nor I were into the actual genre called trance, but the idea behind this four on the floor kind of beat did come from church, and and not only from church, but it came from religious ritual in general. There's something about this that makes a body react and move, and in this very sort of like soul inflected way where you are really, I don't know, going into different and new territory. And this is the kind of spirituality that Sapourin is interested in the sense of like, this doesn't define an identity like somebody telling you, in an us versus them kind of way, we're this kind of people, they're that kind of people. Here's how we do things, here's how they do things. This is a territory, although identity does come in, because eventually you become like as Scott started off, the raver kids or whatever, but like without those kind of labels, when you're, in the listening to music and you're dancing, you're just sort of like exploring something that feels, very new to you, new sorts of identities, new ways of being. And it is a paradigm shift so that you're actually experiencing yourself in a different way that you certainly didn't grow up. I didn't, even though I did grow up on the north side of Chicago. I'm sure Scott experienced himself in new ways, being from southern
Yeah.
Indiana. So it is like this religious experience in which you get to experience the joy of becoming new or becoming different than yourself.
Yeah. And yeah, I think so much could be said about this, but and hopefully we get a chance some like later on, in our podcast to talk more about some of our experiences. But I really, as we mentioned, the dance aspect of it is really important, continues to be really important. And I think is another example of where we see a decentering of it's like of traditional dance in like American dance to kind of like a free form, freestyle dance that like where cultures are learning from each other. There's a cultural interplay that's responding to the music.
Intersubsumption, Brooke Sapourin's term. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean my experience was like it was fascinating because like I saw it like when I, got to see what they call like the footwork or like in Chicago they call it dance footwork, in Detroit they call it jit. That it's a type of dance that's very like it's very fast feet, right? Is like a lot of like foot movement. And I related to that from seeing in Indiana, like buck dancing, square dancing, like where that was the part where you were allowed to be free. So it was like you might have like you're totally still up on top, but your feet are like going crazy, right?
Yeah,
So yeah, it was
from Irish jig dancing. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, so it was like these kinds of these cultures came together. So you can see now that there's like the white raver kids and the black raver kids, the dancers and the house heads are like playing into one another and responding to this music in new ways. I mean, and the music itself is evolving, where we like develop new forms of like electronic music with drum and bass and um, all kinds of all kinds of new micro genres.
Minimal, yeah, right, yeah, all kinds of stuff for sure. And there's just sort of this open flow to where it's sometimes, there's so much mixing of types that you just wind up or intersubsumption, without any kind of like one dominating all the rest or whatever, that you just, you go through all kinds of different, even in one night, depending on what the DJ lineup was, you'd have totally different types of experiences, throughout. And there was an openness to that kind of a thing, which was really in line with the disco spirit of incorporating so many different kinds of music that had up until that point been, not kind of mainstreamed or whatever. But so you have all kinds of Afro and Caribbean rhythms all of a sudden showing up that, had really been, pushed out or pushed away. So there's just a lack of like gatekeeping, and that's the sort of religious experience we're talking about. Like, it's not free of type or genre or it's whatever, but it is something where type or genre can, be a much more playful category than like this definitive this or that kind of a thing, which is sort of like one of the points that Sephora makes in terms of like what is desired is two-ness and not, just another one. So what he's saying there is like what's desired is really multiplicity, not just like another, thing to kind of like knock out everything else and be like the one thing. What's desired in this type of religious experience is not like it is revelation, but it's not the true revelation that like, is stands for all time or whatever. It's this playful revelation space, if you will, where all
Yeah.
kinds of revelations can happen at the same time, even if they're contradictory, and especially if they're contradictory, instead of one, like negating the other, they get to kind of grow up together in a kind of rhizomatic faction, one next to the next.
Yeah, I mean, I think another way to think about that too is like there's kind of a relation to the infinite where it's like there's kind of like an understanding with music and dance and art that there's no end, right? It's kind of like an open-ended sea that will
Mm-hmm.
always be gifting us with new forms, with new ways to interpret our experience, to react and play with our world and what's given to us. And so it's not monolithic. It's not like, oh, here's the dance you get, and you get to use this dance for the rest of
Yeah,
existence or whatever. It's like it's
yeah,
an open-ended, unending, always like changing, but still true. It's not like it still has to mean something, right? It still responds
yeah,
to what
right.
the conditions that it exists in.
Yeah,
But
this is the sort of paradox that Saporin talks about is that purposelessness, and this is like what Uberpiety is. Purposelessness like actually allows for more purposes, multiple purposes. Kind of like one of the informing quotes we talked about, from Nietzsche a bunch, and that Brooke brings up is, not God, but many gods. And that's the sort of idea where a lot of different things can grow up. And
yeah,
that's, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, sorry. As I say, just as we get to that, we want to get through some more examples here.
Yeah, for sure.
I
Yeah.
know, I think you were going to talk about hermeneutics, which I think is like a
Yeah,
really
for sure. Yeah.
great one. But did you have
Yeah.
anything,
So
something else you want?
hermeneutics is like, it just means interpretation. from the Greek god Hermes, who was the messenger god between, people and, well, between the gods and the gods, and between people and the gods, and everything like that. So, anyways, hermeneutics is like this, has this basic understanding that things are ambiguous, and that means that they can't be entirely closed on. So that part of whatever interpretation you give to something still has some, um, you know, some parts that are outside of that interpretation, so that no interpretation can totally incorporate all of being or all of whatever there is. And so there are lots of examples of this. This is sometimes called a hermeneutic circle, where you have this recursive relation to like making an interpretation, talking about meaning, and then having, well, this great word that Brooke comes up with, intersubsumption, where other interpretations then feed in a sort of feedback loop to those, and then they're always changing each other and allowing more to enter, and like there's just like this great sense of play. There can be a great sense of play with interpretation that, I often think of the example of Midrash in, the Jewish tradition, where, the rabbis, would argue, and these arguments were left unresolved, but there was like lots of change and movement in the argument. So people were, responding to each other and affecting each other. And that's what it meant to do midrash. And that's what it meant to be, in a community of interpreters. And we have this same thing, in Christian history, and in but that period of like radical open interpretation, like of the very early church, was quickly shut down because of some of the anxiety of having too many different possibilities to play with. I mean, this is the famous suppression of the Gnostic Gospels, and of a number of writers that didn't fit with what was thought of as orthodoxy. But even within Christian orthodoxy, you have this incredible amount of freedom, because none of the gospels like are without, contradiction, not only within themselves but with each other. None of the epistles, all the way through, Paul, are consistent. His theology shifts and changes, and so there's just all this ambiguity that allows for this open space of interpretation.
Yeah, no, I think it is the Gospels to me is a great example of how once you kind of open yourself to the fact that, oh, they're not only are these Gospels that got canonized, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's also the Gnostic Gospels. There's other Gospels that didn't didn't make it into the official thing, and I mean are add even more uh inconsistency and you could call it confusion, but it's, honestly richness to
Yeah,
what
the
we know.
conversation. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the dance of hermeneutics, the music of hermeneutics, if you will. When I was at the University of Chicago, David Tracy, one of the more famous professors there, was also a priest, and when he would preach at I think Thomas Aquinas, and I was still a practicing Catholic at the time. He would do these unbelievable sermons. I can't even believe he got away with it. But these sermons in which he would, bring in all these classical influences at the time, was what he was specifically into. So he would be preaching all of a sudden about Shakespeare, and then about jazz music, and then about, bringing this all into the gospel message, so that you'd be getting these like constantly new readings of what the scripture can do and what it can mean, just making it move. And so his whole idea of a classic, which included the sacraments and the Eucharist, was like something that was open, and that could constantly be reinterpreted, and brought into this hermeneutic circle. So there was no like official like end, place for this thing to go or whatever. So
Yeah. No, I think these are really cool, really cool, and um, I think clear examples of what we're talking about. I think it gets a little bit more tricky as we move into something that kind of calls itself science, right?
hmm
Where, or like there tends to be a point at which like human beings try to like put on this like cape, and then say, I'm a scientist. And like, so it's like, um, and kind of some of those. I mean, I want to just like go through quickly, um, in, for instance, psychology, which, is a question of like, we can say psychology, science, not a science. No, but we can say, right, theory, right? And theories are, in essence, and in the same sense that what Brooke is talking about, theories can give us a new way to look at our experience that reveals like changes everything about how we our past experience and our future experience, and allows us to potentially live our lives in a new way, or free us from kind of some like maybe some problems that we might be facing. And I think a good example of this for me is like attachment theory in psychology. Um, which, like, I mean, probably a lot of people know about attachment theory at this point, but it's basically, it explains how humans bond with one another. And it's something that is conditioned in us from childhood, from our like relationships with our parents, and in our, ongoing in our relationships with other people as well. But when we view our, relationships through the lens of attachment, we really see that a lot of our failures to communicate with one another can really be just differences in the way we experience intimacy ourselves. So like what we feel as love and closeness can, for some of us, like, be like we really need to be right next to this, person, and have them with us all the time. And for other people, it may be, I feel close to you when we can be apart, and we can, when I can feel some like distance and safety, where I'm regulated in myself and I know you're regulated, and then I know we can come together, to do things, but that we don't totally depend on one another. So like, and it's really hard for two different people to get along get along and see eye to eye when they think the other person is just like them, right? That the other person has needs of, like, intimacy and closeness, but they express it in a completely different way, and experience it in a completely different way. But in any event, it's like, it's kind of undeniable at this point that, people do have these attachment styles, and that it really, like, uh can cast like a light over, like, on all our relationships, and really allow us to, like, some insight into some of the problems that we might be having in our relationships, and hopefully to, make progress on those things. And whether it's a science or not, I think is less important to me in this conversation than the fact that the religious experience of learning about something like attachment theory, or some other theory of like psychological theory, that opens up new avenues of human experience, of our experience of ourselves.
Right, and again, this is like the experience of a shift in your thinking that feels like a new kind of freedom. So, when Saporin talks about, the experience of purposelessness, he's not talking about like having a sense of like no purpose. It's just no overriding purpose, so that you have the freedom to shift out of a way of seeing the world that doesn't work. So like, each theory in psychology that comes along is trying to offer some new way of orienting yourself in the world, so that you can find something that, hopefully works better for you. But none of them is like the ultimate or the right or the complete idea of what human beings are. It doesn't determine them.
Well, and then also, I mean, I think in this conversation too, is like, we want to say that even though it does explain things and it's true and it reveals something true about us, it doesn't mean that it's not revisable, or there won't be something new, some other way to look at our relationships that transforms them in an equally profound way in the future. That maybe it doesn't upend that system, but it maybe like does a better job of, or somehow responds to the needs of that time. But for like right now, in the time that we're living in, attachment theory is really like speaking to people in terms like and helping them understand our relationships.
Yeah. And even within like the hard sciences, so to speak, there are paradigm shifts so that, we are in our imagination, science is like, got a monopoly on the truth. It's just like we have this correspondence theory of truth that most of us just sort of unconsciously operate in, where we imagine that something is true if it like says how things really are or something like that. And so in science, you have various kinds of revolutions about how things really are that, we, think, oh, well, now what the way we thought things were, now there's something different, and this new different thing is the way things really are. But there's this overall effect as you go through different paradigm shifts over time of what's called decentering. And so this is the kind of religious experience again that we're looking for. We're looking for this experience of like your world kind of falling apart, which is deconstruction, and then, shifting into some new way of being in the world. And so we
Yeah,
have,
no. Oh,
go ahead.
I was
Sorry.
oh sorry. I was just going to give the example. I think we've got like the most clear example, in my mind is like the Copernican revolution, right? Where, we go from a universe that where we believe like the Earth is the center of the universe and all of the planets and the stars revolve around the Earth, right? And then at the point at which it becomes undeniable that the Earth is no longer the center, that the not the center of the solar system and certainly not the center of the universe, then that fact it's like it's a fact that it's not just any other fact. It's a fact that radically changes our view of ourselves and our place in the universe. It's this decentering fact, right? And so that's in this sense, science is has a religious dimension, as Brooke mentions. It's like this is the religious dimension of science.
Yeah, and then there are many other famous sort of like big shifts about how we think of ourselves in the world, and Darwinian evolution is another one where we go from thinking of ourselves as somehow elevated above nature, the rest of the animal kingdom for sure, and then now we realize that we are continuous with it or connected to it, that we are an animal among animals in some ways. And then, we have shifts, again with Freud and psychoanalysis in general, to where, we are no longer in control even of our own selves. Like we have all these various disunified intentions within ourselves, so that,
And
our
drives and yeah.
personalities, our drives, yeah, our personalities are not, utterly under our control, and that kind of stuff. Like there's all this, disunity within us. Another scientific revolution that gets, mentioned is, into quantum, from, Newtonian physics into quantum physics. And then there's obviously lots and lots to say there. Again, it is a kind of shift from a sort of like totally determined universe to something that seems a little bit more open, in the sense of we have to describe things probabilistically rather than describing them with determinate causal relations, or what we sometimes call necessary and sufficient reasons that like encompass everything. Every one of those theories, every one of those um, paradigms, they are um, eventually broken, and there's a buildup over time of things that are outside of it that it can't account for, that eventually cause this, what Saporin is calling this religious experience of a shift, where the whole world just changes in the way we see it.
Yeah. And I think like bringing us back to the full circle here, that why atheism is uber piety is because
Mm.
atheism is I guess you could say a religious belief, a belief not in the that is reveals the religious dimension of religion itself. It's like it basically shows that we like religion does the exact same thing of all these examples that we've done. It allows it it can reveal some fact or a change in fact about if there's a God or there's not a God, that changes the whole nature of reality in a radical way, that, and so, this one fact has the potential to completely change our experience of the world. And that's what he says why like monotheism is so stifling is because it's like this one fact that actually just restricts all of these other that all the like the potential of having a religious experience of the changing nature of revelation of like of the like, relationship to the infinite and the sorry we are going to go on, we're going to get more into this in the book, right? I
Yeah, in
know
the
this
next
is what the
chapter, as
book's
a matter
about.
of
So,
fact. Yeah,
yeah.
right. That's right.
So I don't need to keep beating this dead horse. I think we're
Yeah,
kind
as long as you have a like this is right and this is wrong, this is good, this is bad, and it's like just real clear categories like that, you're preventing yourself from all kinds of religious experience.
yes. Great. Well, I think we're at time. So we gotta we made it through the introduction
Sounds
onto
good. Yeah.
onto the meat of the book.
Yeah. Amen. Sounds good.
All right. Talk to you later.
Yep. Talk to you later.